Once the inventory was made, I signed it jointly with these gentlemen who handed me a receipt for 4,000 Napoleons to serve the needs of General Bonaparte on his arrival in St. Helena. My ear, even more than my soul, was severely shocked by this title, and my national pride deeply wounded. Until then, it had not entered my mind that the British government, who had recognized France's right to make Napoleon a general, a consul, and an emperor, since his power had its own representative at the Congress of Châtillon in 1814 to negotiate with him, could today contest this title and give him that of General Bonaparte, leaving him in their eyes not the Emperor Napoleon, but merely the head of the French government. After reading his receipt, I told Mr. Glover I could not accept it without referring it to the Grand Marshal, that the title of general given the Emperor was eminently glorious. But this qualification appeared to me so inconceivable and in such contradiction with history that I could do nothing but go to seek out orders. These are, said Mr. Glover, the terms of the declaration. I left him and went to see Count Bertrand, who said to me, resting his hand affectionately on my shoulder, let them call him what they want. They shall not prevent him from being what he is. Take what they are giving you. I therefore accepted the receipt and a copy of the inventory that were given to me. I understood then that with such behavior, anything could be expected on the part of that government. During this visit, Lord Keith, accompanied by Admiral Cockburn, had come and entered the Emperor's quarters to present him with the last instructions of his government, that of turning over his weapons. Bowing in front of the Emperor in a voice deep with emotion, he said to him, England requests your sword. Saint-Denis, present at this scene, told me the look on the Emperor's face had been dreadful, and that proudly placing his hand on the hilt of his sword, he appeared to defy anyone who would try to take it from him. The two admirals, who were clearly executing an order going against their characters, saluted respectfully as they left. The Austerlitz sword remained suspended at the Emperor's side. Only the firearms were taken. These gentlemen kept their swords, although they had also been demanded of them. The Emperor had learned from the Grand Marshal that the surgeon assigned to him was Baron Corvisor. Prior to leaving Malmaison, would not be following him. He said to me while preparing for bed, Manigault must be very frightened by the instruction of the British government. Is that why he's not accompanying me? Sire, I said to him, he did not allude to that reason. He said to me that apart from the honor of being attached to your Majesty's service, a personal interest had interfered, that of completing some affairs in America where his family was to go, and that he could not go to St. Helena without compromising these same interests. He is afraid of the life of seclusion in St. Helena, replied the Emperor. Besides, he was only with me temporarily. Fourreau shall come and join us. But he has declared very clearly to Bertrand that nothing in the world could persuade him to leave. He is evidently frightened by the stern nature of these instructions. The Emperor had me count out to each of the people who could not accompany him a sum of money in gold to take care of their immediate needs, and a year's wages to those servants who would remain behind. He dictated to me a note for 3,000 francs payable at Monsieur Lafitte's for one of his valets, Gilles Pellissier, whom he could not take with him. The 250,000 francs, which had been hidden from the British investigation, were spread out in 8 belts that we placed around our bodies and were returned to me when we arrived in St. Helena. The Emperor called this sum of money his reserve, or a pair to quench thirst. Each month, I would add a few savings to it. At the Emperor's death, this special fund amounted to 300,000 francs and was used for the first codicil stipulations in St. Helena. Since the Emperor had been on board the Bellerophon, he had talked several times to Dr. O'Meara, surgeon in this vessel, who spoke Italian very well and whose demeanor was frank and open. This surgeon had been to Egypt and conversed with the Emperor about his recollections of the glory and the administration he had left in that country. This circumstance, in conjunction with his ability to express himself in a language known to the Emperor, rendered him more interesting to the Emperor, who, when he spotted him on deck, would call him over and question him on the health of the crew or on other aspects of his art. During the crossing we just made, Dr. O'Meara had attached to several people in the Emperor's retinue who had become seasick. Monsieur Manigault was very ill himself. All praised his kind, affectionate manner. All attempts, even those of the Admiral, having failed to convince Monsieur Manigault to follow the Emperor, he considered having Dr. O'Meara join him, and instructed the Duke of Rovigo-Savary to ask if he would follow him to St. Helena as surgeon attached to his person. The doctor replied that he would accept that honor very gladly if his government did not oppose it, and if he could continue to benefit from his rights as an Englishman. Admiral Keith, advised by the Grand Marshal of the Emperor's desire, promptly granted Dr. O'Meara an unlimited leave of absence with full pay and permission to accompany General Bonaparte to St. Helena in the exercise of his medical functions. On August 7th, after having forgiven Captain Maitland the hatefulness which his government was expressing, the Emperor prepared to leave the Bellerophon. He received those of his officers who could not accompany him. The separation was very sad. On one hand, tears and despair. On the other, calm and consolations given to those who were not to follow him. Then finally, resignation. As he left the stateroom, the Emperor affectionately saluted the officers of the British vessel who were lined up along his path. All were sad at the fatal outcome that henceforth would be associated to the name of the Bellerophon, that of a lack of hospitality. He got into the small boat that had been prepared for him and is following, and reached the Northumberland, saluting with one last look those he was leaving, and whom he knew to be devoted to him heart and soul. Once the Northumberland, the Emperor remained on the bridge to chat with Lord Lowther and Littleton, who were on board, and the conversation was very lively. Only a few moments remained. I used them to write some departing words to my father and mother in Vienna, my family whom I perhaps would never see again. At the moment of sailing, those Frenchmen who had accompanied the Emperor on the Northumberland and had to leave him embraced him with an outpouring of affection which attested to the separation being forever. The Duke of Rovigo-Savary and General Allemant, spotting me, came to me with tears in their eyes and shaking my hand affectionately, entrusting the Emperor to my care. A cutter that was circulating the vessel and kept away boats loaded with curious spectators sank one, and several people perished. 2 women owed their lives to silk dresses that held them afloat in the water. These 2 unfortunate women were brought unconscious aboard our ship to be given first aid, but they were then sent back to the cutter that had sunk them. A few men were saved by hanging onto ropes suspended above the water. There was time to come to their rescue, but the rest of them drowned. The reception given the Emperor on board the Northumberland was neither the one he received on the Bellerophon when he arrived, nor the one he received on board the Superb. Here the orders from the government were strictly adhered to in every respect, much politeness, even graciousness on the part of the Admiral, but for him it was General Bonaparte who was on board, and not Emperor Napoleon. The title of Excellency replaced that of Majesty. On the 8th, 2 frigates and several brigs having joined us with troops on board, the Admiral gave the sign to get underway. After 13 days in Plymouth and 40 days since our departure from Paris, we were sailing for St. Helena. On the 9th, the shores of France became visible through the clouds, and we saw it one last time. The Emperor, who was on deck, removed his hat and remained motionless, saying with intense emotion in his voice, "Adieu, land of the brave. Adieu, France. Adieu." The vessel, which had been only hastily prepared, required order to be established. It was necessary to accommodate all the troops that were on board, and also a few wives of military personnel. The taking on of provisions had not been completed and had to be done on the way. 1,080 people were on board this magnificent ship commanded by Captain Ross, a man of much merit and courtesy. The poop deck had been set up for the Emperor, who occupied the room to the right while entering the main stateroom, and for the Admiral, who had left the room. The stateroom, which was to be common to both, remained out of courtesy for the use of the emperor, who only occupied it part of the day. The admiral only appeared at mealtime. The emperor's iron bed was erected in place of the one that had been prepared for him, a washstand, small table, and an armchair made up of the furniture of this small room lit by a porthole. During the entire crossing, I slept in that room on a mattress provided on board ship. I was often awakened by the emperor, who would ask for his shaded lamp in order to read and take a few notes. The first he took were in La Cretelle. Saint-Denis, as on the Bellerophon, slept in the adjoining room across the doorway. The emperor, wanting to give himself more freedom, said he would have lunch at 10 o'clock in his room, and only emerged around 3 or 4 p.m. He would call these gentlemen in turn to chat with him, maintaining a preference for the Count de las Casas, who, better than the others, could tell him what was happening on board, and whose conversation was most enjoyable for him. I had taken with me 6 small mahogany cases, containing what was called a field library, provided by Monsieur Barbier, the emperor's librarian. These crates consisted of good works, and were of great assistance in fighting the boredom of such a lengthy crossing. The emperor, entering the stateroom after he was dressed, generally remained there until being told dinner was served. Then all those invited gathered. The place of honor at the table was reserved for him. To his right was Countess Bertrand, and to his left the admiral. He was served by Saint-Denis on his right and Novaraz on his left. Other people were arranged in the order of their ranks. He only remained at the table a half hour or 45 minutes at most, if he remained there longer. It was a concession on his part to the admiral, who ordered that the service be accelerated so that the emperor would not be inconvenienced by his habits. On the first day only, the emperor suffered through the duration of an English dinner. Saint-Denis told me that the following day, as long as the crossing lasted, he habitually got up before dessert was served. He would go out on deck, followed in turn by one of these gentlemen, most frequently Count de las Casas, apart from the regulars at the table. 1 land officer and 1 naval officer were invited, and, weather permitting, 1 from the squadron sailing with us. The emperor would ask them a few questions about their careers and always showed them great courtesy. One day, after having left the table to walk on deck, he called the master, who, though responsible for directing the ship, did not hold the rank of officer. He took pleasure in chatting with him and ended by saying, "Come tomorrow and have dinner with me." The master had this invitation repeated to him twice, as it was completely outside of normal discipline and etiquette, and he believed his captain and the admiral would not agree to it. This was not the case. When the admiral learned from the emperor what he wanted, he was most gracious in assuring him that whoever he had invited to the honor of sitting down at his table would be welcome to dinner. It is probable that the emperor would not have had any complaints about Admiral Cockburn had he not felt obliged, as soon as he arrived in St. Helena, to carry out the instructions from the British minister dictated by hate for any human spirit and the rights of man. During the entire crossing, he always showed himself to be very courteous towards the emperor. If he should leave the table to come out on deck where the emperor already was, he would rush up if the weather was bad and offer him his arm, which was always accepted. The emperor had adopted a cannon against which he would lean when he was not walking about. The young midshipman, who kept guard around him so he would not be hurt during maneuvers, named it the emperor's cannon. When night came, the emperor would return to the wardroom, where he would engage in gambling, at which he always lost. Between 9 and 10 p.m., he would retire to his room. Those were the emperor's habits on board the Northumberland and during the entire crossing. Feelings of respect and admiration filled the crew whenever they saw him appear on deck. They admired his noble resignation with respect to the hateful instructions from Lord Bathurst, and were thankful for him for having honored a man's worth in the person of one of the crew. On August 15th, these gentlemen came individually to wish the emperor a happy birthday. The emperor had forgotten about it and was quite touched by this attention which, without demoralizing him, took him back to happier days. He spoke touching words of kindness to one of them. I am told by Saint-Denis that the admiral, informed of the circumstances, that evening at dinner proposed a toast to the health of the emperor, in which all the Englishmen joined. That same evening, it was remarked that he constantly won at gambling, and had he wanted to follow up on his luck, the sum could have been considerable. My luck was such, he said to me in returning, that my winnings reached 80 Napoleons. The emperor had played 21. This luck seemed to me all the more extraordinary, as every day I was obliged to replace in his purse the few Napoleons he had lost while gambling the previous night. During this long crossing, the emperor's health did not suffer. He was of a perfectly even temper, appeared to be entirely indifferent to what was going on around him, and never complained. On the 23rd, we arrived in Madeira, a charming town built on the side of a mountain, houses surrounded by wonderful gardens, rose one above the other, creating a most agreeable, picturesque sight. It was on this island that our provisions were completed. The sirocco was blowing strongly, soon becoming quite furious, a real tempest. The admiral ordered that we put to sea for fear of being thrown against the shore. Our topmasts broke, but the damage was quickly repaired. I had the admiral's butler, who was going ashore, buy me a box of watercolors to help pass the time in St. Helena. During the 2 days we remained in Madeira, I was made quite ill by the pitching and rolling of the ship. Mr. Glover, who had gone ashore, along with the ship's purser, reported that the island had suffered horribly from the storm. The inhabitants, who were Portuguese, superstitiously attributed the arrival of this sirocco on their island to Napoleon. On the night of the 24th to the 25th, all damage had been repaired and provisions completed. We set sail for the Canaries, leaving behind us Tenerife Peak, which we were able to view through our spyglasses for a long time. When we arrived at the tropics, we saw a great number of flying fish. Below this latitude, a mulatto from Guadalupe jumped into the sea during the night, and the sharp cries of "Negro, Negro," which he was shouting, turned the entire ship upside down. The wind was severe, and the sea was quite rough. As quickly as they dropped the sails and lowered a gig to go to his rescue, they could no longer hear the screams, which would allow anyone to locate him. Flares were lit to illuminate the gig, searching for this poor man, but in vain. He disappeared beneath the waters. This man had been led to such an act of despair by the lashes he had received that very morning. Unable to resist the urge to drink, he had again gotten drunk, and in order to avoid the punishment his lack of temperance would bring on him, he had jumped into the sea. As a great deal of commotion had occurred on board ship, the emperor was concerned, and I recounted the circumstances to him. I had been present as one of these punishments was being executed on board ship. The number of lashes administered to the shoulders of the sailors was proportionate to the magnitude of the crime. I had no idea this flagellation could be so barbaric. I could not understand how men would not revolt from such punishment. It seemed to me that the ensuing degradation for the man who received it was such that I could not believe his soul was still capable of any feeling of honor. I am led to believe this turns men into brutes, because I saw a tailor who, having been cut loose after just receiving 20 lashes, still danced a jig. I concluded there was a kind of man who could tolerate such lashings, but that this population could not, like the French nation, give birth to great citizens it could justifiably be proud of, those who had come out of the ranks of the army. British newspapers that had arrived gave the emperor the idea of learning this language. He mentioned it to Count de las Casas, who promised him that in a very few lessons he would be in a position to read these public documents himself. An hour each day was assigned to this lesson, which also served to fight boredom during this long journey. On September 23rd, we arrived at the equator. At this latitude, the sea's calmness allowed the sailors to hold a celebration for crossing the line. We call this celebration of Old Man Equator. To the British, it is the Great Beard. The oldest of sailors becomes Neptune, and those who make up his retinue in the most ridiculous of dress carry him on a seat made of a gun carriage decorated with draperies. On the carriage, he is taken around the ship, then stopping before the captain's quarters, because the normal order of things is reversed on this day, he asks him the names of the passengers who have not yet been initiated into his empire. Addressing himself next to the admiral, who was on the poop deck, he asked about General Bonaparte. The admiral laughingly replied, "He has already passed the equator." 500 Napoleons given to Neptune by the emperor caused the whole crew delirious joy, under whose auspices the festival began. Neptune advanced to the throne, which had been erected for him at the foot of the mainmast. One approached him by climbing 10 steps, and there each one was judged, not according to his deeds, but by the greater or lesser goodwill he showed in presenting himself. All the passengers had to submit to this ceremony, Captain Ross and the ship's chaplain, along with the others. Near Neptune were 2 men remarkable for their Herculean power, bodies tattooed like savages, and like them, wearing only trunks. One of them was armed with an enormous razor, and the other with a pot containing tar, destined to be put on the chins of those who appeared the most obedient. It was they who prompted the greatest delight. Buckets of water were thrown on them from high on the topmasts after they had undergone the bearding process. Then they were chased around the ship everywhere they sought refuge, without being able to escape the buckets of water that were constantly being thrown on them. This festival, where the order of things is completely turned around, where all on board is confusion, where it seems that order will never be restored, after having lasted all day, magically ceased at a signal given by Captain Ross. At once, discipline and order returned to the ship, and the arrival of the breeze, which had just manifested after 20 days' calm, was greeted with joy. We continued to sail with a forceful wind, in formation with the squadron, with nothing remarkable occurring along our route except for the fishing of a few dolphins and the sight of some whales in the distance. At the latitude of the Congo, the admiral, who took great care to see that the emperor's table was always well provided for, sent one of the brigs out to go find fruit and poultry, which it brought back in large quantities. The crossing was becoming quite extended. The admiral had decided to take a route which was not that ordinarily used by trade ships. It followed the coast of Africa instead of that of Brazil, where strong winds invariably led to either St. Helena or to the Cape toward India. Admiral Cockburn's attempt to follow an unusual route caused us to remain at sea 17 days longer than we should have. The brig and the frigate, which the storm in Madeira had separated from us, arrived in St. Helena 17 days before the Northumberland. The crossing was becoming tedious for the emperor, who, accustomed to much exercise, could not find an opportunity to take any. A few dictations to General Gourgaud or to Count de las Casas were the only distraction during the day, and even then, he was not set up well for this type of affair. He was anxious to arrive in the place of exile, no matter how sad the scene might be. For several days, dolphins had been appearing in abundant quantities, and the sailors caught a few of them, which they ate. The emperor wanted to eat some and found the flesh quite good, but that was not the case with shark meat, which he found disgusting. Everything was cause for distraction on board. One day, there was a remarkable noise on deck caused by the capture of a shark some 6 feet long, and the emperor asked me what was occurring. When I told him that the fish just caught weighed 180 pounds, he wished to see it and took pleasure in the struggle that it was waging against the sailors. They began to skin it, and the tail thrashing against the deck was so frightening that the emperor, who had moved in a little too close, was almost wounded. Inside this young shark were found remnants of human clothing. Every day I was present at the taking of the ship's position, and although quite slowly, we were closing in on St. Helena. On October 14th, we were to see this island. In the afternoon, someone cried, "Land!" And immediately all eyes turned in the direction given, looking for Diana's Peak, which we were told was the highest point on St. Helena. We spotted it under a clear sky 15 leagues away, but it could only be seen through a spyglass on the horizon. At 9 p.m., the Northumberland dropped its sails for the night. A corvette sent out from the convoy on orders of the admiral approached the shore to announce our arrival. On the 15th, 70 days after our departure from the coast of England and 110 days after our departure from Paris, we were dropping anchor in St. Helena, which appeared repulsive to us. Contrary to this normal practice, the emperor got dressed early to go up on deck and get an overall view of the island, which he could only see imperfectly from the porthole in his cabin. He had before him a sketch of that part of the island where we were. He had told me to bring it along, and I had given it to him heavy with sorrow. Once dressed, he went up on deck with his small spyglass in hand. One could not see the town, hidden by a terrace that followed the contours of the bay. One could only see the square church tower through the foliage, sitting between two enormous bare rocks that rose perpendicularly above the sea to a considerable height and seemed to be equipped with gunnery units on several levels. The governor's palace, surrounded by trees, appeared a pleasant residence. Everything else was a large rock devoid of any vegetation. No matter how great my desire to see land, I could only greet this like a grave. After watching for a few moments, the emperor went back to his cabin without comment, allowing no one to guess what was transpiring in his soul. As for myself, I was so weary of this floating house, so tired of the titles of General and Excellency given to the emperor, that no matter what the place where we would have to live, providing that we would be there alone, I would prefer it to the Northumberland. For 2 days, the inhabitants remained on the piers, waiting to see the emperor at the moment he disembarked. Each evening at sundown, they would go back home, disappointed in their expectations.